In the summer of 2014, two teenagers in Massachusetts were in love with each other in the way that teenagers often are, intensely, digitally, almost entirely through a screen. They lived about 35 miles apart. They had met in person only a handful of times. What they had between them existed mostly in text messages, thousands of them, sent back and forth across the distance, constructing a relationship out of words. Conrad Roy was 18 years old. He wanted to be a tugboat captain. He had a loving family. He struggled with depression in the way that some people do, genuinely and seriously, in a darkness that those who have not experienced it can be slow to recognize from the outside. Michelle Carter was 17 years old. She went to high school in Wrentham. She was thin and blonde and popular in the way that mattered at her school. She also struggled with anxiety, with an eating disorder, with the pressure of being visible in ways that felt hollow. They found each other, and for a time, each was the person the other told their hardest things to. On the evening of July 12, 2014, Michelle Carter was on the phone with Conrad Roy as he died. He had asked her what to do. She had told him. When he got scared and climbed out of the vehicle, she told him to get back in. 2 months later, she texted a friend, "I could have stopped him, but I didn't." That text message became the center of a trial that asked a question American law had never been forced to answer before. Can words alone be murder? Conrad Roy III was born on September 12, 1995, in Mattapoisett, Massachusetts, a small coastal community on Buzzards Bay, the kind of town where people know boats and water and each other. He was the son of Conrad Roy Jr. and the grandson of the family patriarch in the local marine salvage business. Conrad had grown up around that world, around tugboats and maritime work and the specific satisfaction of labor that was physical and skilled and meaningful. He wanted to be a captain. He had enrolled at the Northeast Maritime Institute in Fairhaven to pursue that goal. Those who knew him described a young man who was kind, who was close to his family, who was funny in ways that surprised people. His aunt, Kim Bozzi, spoke about him in a way that made his absence feel specific and real, a particular person, not a type. But Conrad also carried something heavy. He had struggled with depression since at least 2012, when his parents divorced. The darkness he described in text messages and in videos he recorded of himself was genuine, clinical in its consistency, not teenage melodrama. He had seen mental health professionals. He had been prescribed medication. He had made previous attempts on his life. Each time, something had stopped him, or he had sought help, or the moment had passed. In the summer of 2014, one did not pass. Michelle Carter was born on August 11, 1996, in Plainville, Massachusetts. She attended King Philip Regional High School in Wrentham. What emerges from the court record, from the texts, and from those who knew her is a portrait of a young woman who was struggling in her own ways. She had been treated for an eating disorder at a hospital facility. She was taking medication for anxiety and depression. She wanted, in the particular way that some teenagers want, to be seen as important, to matter, to be the person others needed. She and Conrad had met briefly in Florida in 2012 when both were visiting relatives. They lived about 35 miles apart in Massachusetts but rarely saw each other in person. Instead, they built something in the space between phones, a relationship made almost entirely of text messages, calls, and digital intimacy. At the beginning, that relationship included genuine care. When Conrad spoke of suicide in 2012, Michelle told him not to. She told him he had so much to live for. She encouraged him to get professional help. She was, in those early messages, the voice that said no. But relationships between two struggling people in their teens do not stay static. The dynamics shifted. Conrad's darkness deepened. And somewhere along the way, Michelle Carter's voice changed. In the weeks before July 2014, the text messages between Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter shifted in a direction that prosecutors would later describe as calculated and deliberate, and that defense attorneys would describe as the confused, distorted communications of two mentally unwell teenagers feeding each other's worst impulses. The messages discussed method. They discussed timing. Michelle researched options. Conrad expressed the ambivalence that is common in people contemplating suicide, the back and forth between the darkness and the part that was not ready. Michelle, in these later messages, pushed consistently in one direction. "You just have to do it," she texted him. "You're ready, you're prepared, you have everything ready." She told him once he was dead he would be happy and free. She told him she would be there. She made promises about what would happen after. Over 4,000 text messages were introduced as evidence at trial. Legal analysts noted that among the most damaging to Carter was not a text she sent to Conrad, but a text she sent to a friend named Samantha 2 months after his death. In September 2014, trying to process what had happened, Samantha asked Michelle about the night Conrad died. Michelle responded, "His death is my fault. Like honestly, I could have stopped it. I was on the phone with him and he got out of the car because it was working and he got scared and I told him to get back in because I knew he would do it all over again the next day." She kept talking, "I could have easily stopped him or called the police, but I didn't." Those two admissions, that Conrad had gotten out of the truck frightened, and that Michelle had told him to return, and that she had chosen not to call anyone as he died, would become the spine of the prosecution's case. On the evening of July 12, 2014, Conrad Roy drove to the parking lot of a Kmart in Fairhaven and sat in his truck. He and Michelle were on the phone together. At some point during that call, the carbon monoxide inside the vehicle became perceptible enough that Conrad got out. He stepped into the open air. He was frightened. The judge who later presided at trial described what happened next based on the evidence before him. "Carter," he said, "instructed Roy to get back into the truck, well knowing of all of the feelings he had exchanged with her, his ambiguities, his fears, his concerns." Conrad Roy got back in. Michelle Carter stayed on the phone. She did not call the police. She did not call his family. She did not, as the judge would later note pointedly, issue a simple additional instruction, "Get out of the truck." She listened. Conrad Roy died of carbon monoxide poisoning. His body was found the following morning, July 13th, when a passerby discovered the truck in the parking lot. In the hours after his death, Michelle Carter texted mutual friends asking if they had heard from Conrad. She asked his family if they knew where he was. She presented herself as someone who did not know what had happened. In a note he left behind, Conrad Roy apologized to his family and asked them to live life to the fullest. He was 18 years old. In the weeks following Conrad's death, his family began to process what had happened. His mother, Lynn Roy, and his aunt, Kim Bozzi, became the public faces of a family that had lost someone they loved and was struggling to understand why. Investigators recovered Conrad's phone. They found the text messages. Thousands of them. The record of months of conversations in which the woman who called herself his girlfriend had moved systematically from telling him to live to telling him to die. Michelle Carter was indicted on February 4, 2015, on charges of involuntary manslaughter. She was 17 at the time of Conrad's death. The court treated her as a youthful offender, meaning she could be sentenced as an adult, but the proceedings would occur in juvenile court. What followed was 2 years of legal argument, appeals, and constitutional debate before the case reached trial. Carter's defense team argued the case should be dismissed entirely, that text messages were speech, and that speech, however horrifying, was protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. They argued that Conrad Roy had been suicidal long before Michelle Carter entered his life, that the decision to end his life was his own, and that making Carter criminally responsible for someone else's choices was a legal overreach with chilling implications for how the law treats words. The prosecution argued something different. They argued that Carter had moved from words to action when she told a frightened man climbing out of a deadly environment to climb back in. That she had taken a physical step, or the functional equivalent of one, that directly caused his death. That her virtual presence in that truck had overwhelmed his will. In June 2017, on the day before the trial was scheduled to begin, Michelle Carter waived her right to a jury trial. She put her fate in the hands of Judge Lawrence Moniz alone. The trial of Michelle Carter lasted 6 days in June 2017. It was followed nationally and internationally, a case that legal scholars had been debating for 2 years before a single piece of evidence was heard in open court. Prosecutors played text messages. They laid out the timeline. They described what Carter had done in the context not of reckless teenage communication but of a sustained, deliberate campaign that ended in a man's death. She assisted and devised and advised and planned, prosecutor Mary Claire Flynn told the court. And on July 12, 2014, as his truck was filling, he was scared. The defense described a different picture. A troubled girl who had been drawn into the suicidal ideation of a boy who had been contemplating this for years. A 17-year-old who was herself on psychiatric medication, including Celexa, which some studies linked to increased suicidal thoughts as a side effect, and who had not been equipped, emotionally or cognitively, to handle what Conrad was asking of her. A teenager who in some of her worst messages had essentially co-authored a tragedy she did not have the tools to prevent. On June 16, 2017, Judge Moniz delivered a 15-minute explanation of his verdict. He was specific about the moment that mattered most. Carter had instructed Roy to get back into the truck, he said. Her virtual presence had overwhelmed Roy's own willpower. But for the defendant's admonishments, pressure, and instructions, the judge found the victim would not have gotten back into the truck. She had heard his last breaths on the phone. She had not called the police. She had not called his family. She had not said, "Get out." "Miss Carter," Judge Moniz said, "please stand." This court, having reviewed the evidence and applied the law thereto, now finds you guilty on the indictment charging you with the involuntary manslaughter of the person Conrad Roy III. Michelle Carter cried silently as the verdict was read. At sentencing on August 3, 2017, Conrad Roy's family spoke. His aunt Kim Bozzi said, "She has to live the rest of her life in her own skin, as her one of the most hated people in the country, so good luck with that." Carter also spoke. She said she was sorry. She said she hoped the Roy family could someday find peace. Judge Moniz sentenced her to 2.5 years in prison, with 15 months to serve and the remainder suspended, plus 5 years of probation. To many observers, the sentence felt inadequate for what had happened. To others, it was itself too much for what they believed had been a tragic entanglement between two mentally ill teenagers, not a crime in any meaningful sense of the word. Carter's attorneys appealed immediately, arguing the case raised First Amendment and Fifth Amendment constitutional issues serious enough to warrant review. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court heard the case and upheld the conviction on February 6, 2019. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear it. Carter began serving her sentence on February 11, 2019. On January 23, 2020, she was released from the Bristol County House of Correction, 3 months early for good behaviour. She had served 15 months. She has maintained an extremely low public profile since her release. She is, as of 2026, under probation supervision. Conrad Roy's mother, Lynn Roy, has spent the year since her son's death advocating for what she calls Conrad's Law, legislation that would impose a mandatory minimum 5-year sentence on anyone convicted of coercing another person into suicide. She has testified before Massachusetts legislators. She has given interviews. She has said repeatedly that she will never stop honoring her son. The case of Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy is studied in law schools now. It sits at the intersection of several questions that the digital age has forced the legal system to confront without adequate preparation. Can words transmitted by text message constitute a physical act sufficient to support a manslaughter charge? The Massachusetts court said yes. Legal scholars remain divided. Does the First Amendment protect speech that encourages someone in a vulnerable state to take their own life? The court said no, but the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts filed a brief in support of Carter, arguing that criminalizing speech, however reprehensible, sets a precedent that could extend to online arguments, dark humor, or anyone who talks to someone about death without intending a specific harm. What duty do we owe each other, particularly in the diffuse, always-on, text-mediated relationships that define modern adolescence, when someone we know is in crisis? The law has an answer, now, for the specific facts of this case. It does not have an answer for the vastness of the territory that surrounds it. The HBO documentary I Love You, Now Die, released in 2019 in 2 parts, examined the case through the lens of both Conrad's depression and Carter's behavior, presenting a portrait of 2 young people in crisis who found each other in the worst possible way. The Hulu limited series The Girl from Plainville, released in 2022 with Elle Fanning as Carter, dramatized the same material with a specific focus on Carter's inner life and the distorted psychological logic that led to the text she sent. Neither fully resolved the question of how to feel about what happened. That may be because there is no fully resolved answer. Conrad Roy III dreamed of being a tugboat captain. He was 18 years old and beginning the life that dream would require. He was also carrying something dark and heavy that the people who loved him were trying to help him set down. He is gone. That is the fact at the center of this case, and it should not get lost in the legal arguments, the constitutional debates, or the cultural conversation about what Michelle Carter did or did not do, who she was or was not. A young man is dead. His family lives inside that. His mother has spent over a decade turning her grief into advocacy, trying to ensure that what happened to her son changes something in the law so it cannot as easily happen to someone else. Michelle Carter served 15 months. She is free. Whether the law found the right answer, whether 15 months was justice, whether criminalizing words sets a precedent that protects the vulnerable or threatens something essential about speech, is a question that legal scholars, ethicists, and true crime audiences will still be arguing about for a very long time. What is not arguable is this: Conrad Roy got out of that truck. He was frightened. He was, in that moment, choosing to live. Someone told him to get back in. If you are struggling right now, please reach out. In the US, call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You do not have to carry this alone. Subscribe to Quick Crime Vault. Every case in this vault deserves to be told with care, especially the ones that ask the hardest questions. We'll see you in the next vault.